Well, hey, good morning, friends. Thanks for coming back and joining me as we are getting closer and closer to the end of the book of Nehemiah. We're going to finish chapter 12 this morning and in our next installment. And then that just leaves us with one chapter left. So we'll probably have a little bit of buffer time between finishing Nehemiah and getting into and wrapping things up as we kind of launch Sunday nights again and the devotions come to a conclusion. But in between that time, I think what we'll probably do is we'll talk about some matters of Christology. And one of the classes that I've taken this summer, just trying to wrap up my MDiv, is Systematic Theology 2, which covered a lot of the aspects of Christ, his human nature, his divine nature, the aspects of atonement, the cross, why the cross, extent of the atonement, and so forth. Just some fascinating subjects that I was able to study in that class. And I think you would equally benefit from diving into a couple of those topics as well. So we'll get to that hopefully in about a week or so. But right now we're focusing on chapter 12. Now this is probably my favorite part of the entire book of Nehemiah. You know, I'm a worship pastor, so I have this predilection toward passages of Scripture which help us to see worship, to understand worship. Passages which help us deepen our understanding of the purpose and the goal of worship, especially as it's applied in the corporate setting. And this passage does that. As the wall has been completed and the people are beginning to resettle in Jerusalem, it's time to dedicate the work that they have done to the Lord. And so this is the same kind of dedication moment that the people experienced back in Ezra chapter 6 when they had finished the temple. They finish the project and then they dedicate that project to the glory of God. And so what this portion of Nehemiah 12 does is no different than Ezra 6. But the question is, why are they doing this? Well, they're doing this because this is Jerusalem. I mean, this is God's city. It's where his name is made known. This is where the people of Israel come to declare the glory and the praise of Yahweh. It's why the temple is located in this place. This is where the worship of God happens. And so as they realize that this project that they finished is all by the mighty hand of God, through his sustaining, through his protecting, through his provision, even by human means, that this is all of God. And therefore they're going to dedicate this work. So without reading the entire passage, I am going to read the passage for us, but I'm going to read it in chunks, just for sake of time. I want to begin in verse 27. This is where we're going to start. We'll go towards, we'll get close to the end of the chapter. In verse 27 it says, "And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all their places, to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgiving, and with singing, with cymbals, harps, and lyres." So, what verse 27 is trying to help us understand is this cyclical role that the Levites and the priests had in Israel. See, way back in, I think it was 1 Chronicles 24, David had organized these priests into 24 orders, which made for 2 sets of priests for each month of the year. And so what would happen is these men, well, of course they had to take care of their families, and so they would be on duty as priests for 2 weeks out of the year. And then the rest of that year, they would tend to their own families. They'd raise their crops, tend to the livestock, providing whatever ways were necessary. So what they're doing is more than just the priests that are on duty. They're calling for all of the priests that are in the order. Bring all of them into Jerusalem here, because they want all of these priests to be present to participate in this magnificent corporate worship event that's about to unfold. They're going to be gathering with all the people in the center of town with thanksgiving and with singing. And as the verse indicates, they're going to be using a large number of instruments, which includes cymbals and harps and lyres. So they're essentially gathering the worship band in a sense. But then we look at verses 28 through 30. And it says, "And the sons of the singers gathered together from the districts surrounding Jerusalem and from the villages of Netophathites, also from Beth Gilgal, and from the region of Geba and Asmaveth. For the singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem. And the priests and the Levites purified themselves, and they purified the people and the gates and the wall. So what is this purification ritual? We're not entirely sure. It may have involved some kind of sacrifice. There may have likely been some ceremonial cleansing involved, much like the priests would have even done back when they were conducting service in the tabernacle during the wilderness journey of the Israelites after the Exodus. So there's a couple of different factors that may go into this purification, this cleansing that they're going through. But I want you to pay attention to the fact that this purification of themselves, it's not just these priests and Levites, but it also says they purified the people and the gates and the wall. So what that means is this was an inclusive event. This was part of this dedication ceremony that's taking place. This overall worship service here as part of the dedication of the wall in Jerusalem, this is one of those steps. But then look as this larger chunk develops in verses 31 through verse 37. Then I, this is Nehemiah speaking, brought the leaders of Judah up onto the wall and appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks. One went to the south on the wall to the dung gate, and after them went Hoshea and half of the leaders of Judah, and Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, and Jeremiah, and certain of the priest's sons with trumpets, Zechariah, the son of Jonathan, son of Shemaiah, son of Mattaniah, son of Micaiah, son of Zakur, son of Asaph, which we trace back to the Psalms, same Asaph, and his relatives, Shemaiah, Azarel, Milalai, Gilalai, Maai, Nethanel, Judah, and Hanani, with the musical instruments of David, the man of God. And Ezra the scribe went before them. At the fountain gate they went up straight before them by the stairs of the city of David, at the ascent of the wall, above the house of David, to the water gate on the east. So in this chunk of scripture, we've got a lot of names, and we've got a lot of movement that's going on, physical movement here. As they're moving, it says in verse 37, they went up straight before them by the stairs of the fountain gate, at the ascent of the wall, to the water gate on the east. But I want you to pay attention to the fact that what we're about to see here in this section that I just read and the next section that comes afterwards, paragraph we could say, there are 2 massive choirs that are being put together to join in this celebration. And if the number of the choir is not great enough, notice that Nehemiah says in verse 31 that I brought the leaders of Judah up onto the wall and appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks. They're literally standing on the wall here. They are surrounding the city and meeting in the center of town. And from this description here, it seems that the choirs are meeting at the valley gate. Now, does that sound familiar? Because it should. Remember, the valley gate was where Nehemiah began when he conducted his midnight reconnaissance mission around the city of Jerusalem to survey the work that needed to be done before the project began. This was shortly after they had arrived in the city. Now, it's interesting because there's a lot of irony in this passage that I hope, if you haven't picked on, you'll see here in a moment. Nehemiah goes out by night to survey the project by the valley gate. So essentially, it's kind of the inception of where they start working. But don't let the significance of the people standing on the wall evade you. Okay, so we have the significance of the valley gate and the correlation there. But notice that these people are literally standing on the wall. Why is that so significant? Well, remember what Tobiah said way back in chapter 4. These guys are taunting the nation of Israel. They're taunting these people that are working on this wall. And what does Tobiah say? Well, as I'm paraphrasing, he basically says, you know, if a fox walked up to that wall, he could climb up it or touch it, and it would just fall apart. I mean, here's a guy standing on the outside taunting the people for their efforts. And he's saying that the construction project that they're engaged in is about as helpful as trying to defend yourself behind a sandcastle. it would just fall apart. So, but now there are dozens, if not hundreds of men standing on top of the wall, declaring the glory and the greatness of God, who sustained them through the project and protected them until it was completed. How's that for irony? As if they're saying, okay, Tobiah, how does your little taunt hold up now? And on top of this, remember back in chapter 3 that there are these nobles who literally thought that the Jerusalem reconstruction was beneath them, and they didn't want to get involved. Remember that? So now Nehemiah, likely these are the same kind of nobles that Nehemiah is bringing to stand on top of the wall in verse 31. Essentially, it's as if Nehemiah is saying, wait, you thought this wasn't worth the effort? You thought this wasn't worth your time? Well, how about now? How do you feel now that God has worked through us to bring this to pass? As they're literally standing on top of the wall that they thought wasn't worth the effort. Very likely this was a humbling experience for these arrogant nobles, especially if those sentiments of chapter 3 had still remained by chapter 12. But now we have these two great choirs. And we read about the first one just a moment ago. One of these great choirs has Hoshea as the representative lay leader, and Ezra is part of this. And half the leaders of Jerusalem here are on the right wall near the dung gate. And they're carrying with them a large amount of instruments, whether it's one per person or every other person, every third person, whatever. We don't know that for sure. But what we do know is that the number of these people is great, and the representation in instruments is great as well. And then there's a parallel choir. I mean, it's one thing to have one great choir, but two great choirs. I mean, like, we're worshiping in stereo here. This is awesome. Look at what verse 38 through verse 43 says. The other choir of those who gave thanks went to the north, and I followed them with half of the people. This is Nehemiah speaking, and on the wall, and above the tower of the ovens, to the broad wall, and above the gate of Ephraim, and by the gate of Yeshana, and by the fish gate, and the tower of Hananel, and the tower of the 100 to the sheep gate. And they came to a halt at the gate of the guard. So, both choirs of those who gave thanks stood in the house of God. And I and half of the officials with me, and the priests Eliakim, Maaseiah, Miniamin, Micaiah, Elionai, Zechariah, and Hananiah, with trumpets, and Maaseiah, and Shemaiah, Eleazar, Uzi, Jehonanan, Malchijah, Elam, and Azer. And the singers sang with Jezrahiah as their leader. And they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. So, now that we have the other choir with Nehemiah involved, this choir also has a large amount, equal representation, with priests, with lay leaders, with significant musical instrumentation. And so what's happening is these two choirs are now converging at the temple, as described in verse 40. And so what's happening is the two great choirs are encircling the city, converging at the temple as they unitedly lift up their voices and instruments in praise to the great God who made both of these projects possible. Although they're specifically looking at the dedication of the wall here. But can you picture it? Likely none of us have ever witnessed or seen a worship service quite like this. I mean, this was no small feat that God had helped them accomplish, which called for nothing less than no small gathering in worship as they dedicated this wall and they thanked God for what he had done. I mean, what a scene here. What a glorious moment of exaltation to the sovereign Lord of all. And notice that it says in verse 43, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. Don't miss the significance in that. Not only is the sheer volume of their praise so great that it carries beyond the walls and beyond the city, but I would venture to say that perhaps these taunting enemies, Sanballat, Tobiah, Gershom, and others, the ones that we haven't heard about for a few chapters now, perhaps they even heard the praise of God's people. Now, if they're miles and miles away, likely not. But if they're anywhere near the city, maybe, just maybe, they heard God's people praising him in that moment. What a magnificent rebuttal to all the taunts of the enemies as these people are finally humiliated in understanding this was God's doing. That wall is finished. Ouch. The people are safe. Man, messed up their plans, right? And now, to add insult to injury in a sense, now they're hearing the praise of God's people, glorifying him for what he has done in Jerusalem. And the enemies of those people can't do anything about it. God is glorified and they are humiliated. And I want us to know, I want us to take away from this, that moments like these should not be reserved for pinnacle moments in history. Remember, friends, that our great God is worthy of this kind of praise and exaltation always. There is an even greater work that has taken place beyond a rebuilt temple or defensive walls and gates being set up again in Jerusalem. Remember, if you are a follower of Christ, God has done a glorious work in you. And that work, my friends, is worthy of a worship scene so infinitely beyond what we read about in Nehemiah 12. But the question is, do you worship him in a way that reflects this? If not, can I encourage you to commit yourself to doing so? I mean, he is worthy. He is glorious. He deserves all of our praise and our devotion to him. So may this scene that we have read about this morning prompt your corporate worship response as we have the chance this weekend to gather with God's people, to sing his praises, to glory in the gospel that has transformed our lives. I know I'm looking forward to spending that time with you, and then we'll finish up chapter 12 as we get together next time.